Hey everyone, we just wanted to let you know that after we had finished recording the upcoming podcast, we discovered that there was an issue with my microphone that was causing an echo. We have fixed that going forward, but it's going to exist in this podcast. We apologize for that, but we do feel that what we talked about, and especially what Jason Beardsley shared, was very important. So we hope that you enjoy the podcast. And thank you very much for listening. On this episode of Money and Power, we talk about the military ego, why killing people in person is better than using drones, and why you shouldn't gamble on abortion billboards. But first, Kid Ink.
I got the money and the power. Yeah. Once you get a little, they just want to take you down, cuz we've been going hard for too long. Can't get enough, what is you on? Yeah. Really ain't nothing I could drop that. Wake up in the morning, make it all okay. It's nothing to get it poppin', wanna roll up and away, here we go. Now Martin had a dream, I've been dreaming about gold.
Welcome to episode 5 of Money and Power, our weekly look at questions related to finance, politics, and culture. I'm your host, Nathan Martin, and joining me from Columbus is Jason Beardsley, soldier, businessman, and all-around awesome dude you have to know. Thank you for joining us, Jason.
Man, I'm excited to be here. Good to have you.
All right, and also joining us from Ohio is Jeremiah Martin, a grunt, a cannon cocker, and a Bible thumper for your trenches.
There you go. Hello.
So, as you can tell, Rob is not joining us. He is on assignment. We sending our cast out on tons of assignments, but he's going to be heading to Iowa to do an event, and so it is the three of us. So we called in a good friend of ours, Jason Beardsley, and Jason, can you just give us a brief bio of why you are so awesome?
Well, that would be really brief because there are plenty that would argue I'm not. But to cover down on my particulars, I love America. I grew up Boy Scout, went to my Eagle Scout, and from there launched into military service, starting with the Navy way back in the first Persian Gulf War. Wanted to be a SEAL. It didn't work out, and I flipped over to the United States Army Special Forces. That's where I belonged. I got my Green Beret. And after 9/11, did a lot of fun stuff, went over to a Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC counterterrorist unit, and from there did some pretty fantastic things against the enemy to deliver justice in some of the worst places in the world. I'm happily married, 22 years, 3 daughters, and got into the veterans advocacy space with guys like you, Nathan, and you, Jeremiah, so we could fight for smart legislation to really make sure we embrace those veterans that have come back home from these wars. That's a kind of a nutshell. I started a business to express how much we love America and really put together some products that people could wear with pride how they feel about this country. So all together, I've done a lot of great things, and I've just enjoyed pouring back a little bit of some of the talent that others have poured into me.
Well, thank you for all that. And I tell you what, I was impressed with this man from the first time that I met him. And I am excited to have him on here because his story and the things and his experience and what he brings to not just the conservative movement, but to leadership dynamics and Christendom as a whole is a real value add. So I'm really excited for this podcast. So again, thank you for joining us. And now it is time for our look back at the weird, the inane, and the general happenings going on in the world by the crazy people who happen to live here. News Bits. All right, so brand new to News Bits. Jason, what do you got?
Well, I think this week was a fantastic week for those of us who have watched American diplomacy overseas. we saw the opening yesterday of the embassy in Jerusalem, Israel. That was a huge deal. Of course, the state of Israel declared back in 1948. United Nations recognized it. But since the end of that, really our war, and since the beginning of the 60s and 70s, there's been conflict, and every president since then has talked about recognizing what the Israelis have recognized all along, which is their national capital. And with a lot of consternation and bickering and sort of hem-hawing and dragging our feet, we had a president finally make that promise in the campaign trail, which I think we've all heard before. But this week we actually saw that they actually did it. Now, that's fascinating. Anybody who knows government work and federal work knows you can't build an embassy in anything less than 10 years for $2 billion. And if you haven't seen embassies overseas, we constantly wait. We talk about them. Well, President Trump actually said he was going to do it, scotched the deal to build the $10 billion embassy and flipped it to an existing building on a property we already owned. And they are celebrating in Israel today. And I think that's one of the massive news events of this administration. Very exciting for a lot of people. Still a little bit controversial for others who have kind of fought to keep that embassy from opening in the capital of Jerusalem. So it's kind of a massive shift in the landscape of foreign diplomacy for the United States. Very exciting. And even if you're concerned about it a little bit, one thing you have to know, or one great takeaway, is if you wanted to see things done differently, well, this is what it looks like.
And you know what? I have to applaud the move. I honestly didn't think it was going to happen. I thought it was just going to be a campaign promise, and we would be, in 2020, and it would just be another campaign promise gone by the wayside. But it happened really quickly, and it's really cool too. I saw that there's one of the Jerusalem soccer team. They renamed their team to include Trump's name, which is pretty phenomenal. Now we obviously have to talk about the headlines that have come out from Hamas, right, and them kind of attacking the border, that's if all the positive news that are coming out of Jerusalem with the opening of the embassy, that's kind of the antithesis of the positive, and how kind of our news media is kind of taking that. But you know what? We'll focus on the positive, and I think that's a really great move. I can't, on the heels of the Iran deal that we got out of, and on the heels of what's going on in North Korea, albeit, a little more tepid today. There was some news, but, I am giving this foreign policy at least one thumbs up, probably two thumbs up so far. So,
yeah, it's fascinating, and you're absolutely right. There's the other side where I think it was 58 Palestinians or so, my last count, wounded or injured in the protest, and that's a long drawn out thing. It wasn't specifically over the embassy, but it coincided with its opening, and so we want to pause and we recognize there's some tension in the area. So the greater hopes is that over time that tension gets ameliorated, mitigated. And we saw today that was a much lighter day for violence. And I think given time, the world will come along, and what we'll be able to do is something that I think most nations would understand if it was given to them, which is in your nation, you get to declare what your capital is. And though there may be some fighting over land and territorial rights, that fight has been going, I think, 70 years now. Yeah. That's the 70-year anniversary for Israel. So it's really time to put that in the past and move towards the next stage of peace and comity between these parties.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is all the misinformation that you see around this issue. You really start to see a little bit of the bias in different news outlets from the headlines and the perspective that they're pushing. On the one hand, this is a huge deal, but on the other hand, part of me is like, it almost shouldn't be a huge deal because, there's been legislation on the books permitting this since 1995. And so this is not a revolutionary thing. It was at one point a bipartisan legislation rallied around this idea. But every president since then has pushed the ball down the field and passed the buck. And, ultimately, President Trump was the first person to, follow through on that legislation that's already on the books. So it's like, on the one hand, this is a huge deal. It's incredible. But there's a lot of misinformation out there as far as what this actually entails, what it actually means. And, at one point, this wasn't such a revolutionary idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Jason, for that. That was awesome. That was a great first news bit for you, my friend. Good job.
Good week. Good week to celebrate.
Yeah. All right, Jeremiah.
Yeah, so turn the corner here back to from international news, going back to a little more local news to us here in Ohio. Anyone who's here in Ohio, who travels around Cleveland may have seen some of these billboards that I'm gonna reference. But it's a local news story, but it's also become in the past weeks and past even couple months. It's also caught national headlines. So here's the story. Preterm, which is Ohio's largest abortion facility, put out a series of billboards in the greater Cleveland area talking about what abortion is. And so these let me pull up the list here. So they put out a series of billboards saying things like abortion is sacred, abortion is a blessing, abortion is necessary, abortion is a family value, abortion is gender equality, abortion is good medicine. And they put out a total of 16 of these, and all across the greater Cleveland area. And so a group of pro-life organizations got together and fundraised a kind of a response to this. And so they attempted to put out kind of a response to what abortion really is. And so they put out tried to put out billboards saying abortion is fake feminism, abortion is lost fatherhood, abortion is violence, abortion is systemic racism, and several others. But what was interesting is some of the same companies that allowed the pro-abortion billboards out there initially banned some of these pro-life responses. And so there's been this back and forth. Obviously, you have a physical back and forth in the billboards on one side and the billboards on the other. But then there's all over the web and catching national headlines is this idea of pro one side or the other, and this side is ridiculous and this side is ridiculous. Well, one of the specific topics is relating to racism and to one of them says abortion is genocide, and so talking about this issue, when you look at the billboards, they are targeted in typically low income areas, and they're pushing for they claim to be educating on this topic, but. So people that are in favor of preterm's billboards have posed the question. They've said, is it true that people of color seek abortions at a higher rate than any other demographic? Yes. Is it also true that youth of color are at a disproportionately higher risk for negative sexual health outcomes? Also, yes. So the debate is kind of this ongoing conversation is this a chicken or the egg type situation? Is abortion really systemic racism? Is it really genocide? But you're obviously the issue is obviously touching very, very sensitive topics on both sides. When one side's making claims like abortion is a blessing, and the other side's making claims that abortion is genocide, Obviously, very, very heated discussions and I think a conversation that should be happening. I just wanted to kind of push it to you guys and see what you think. Is this a chicken and the egg type thing, or where can we move on from here when you have these obviously polarized views?
Wow.
Jason.
Yeah, that's it's an amazing concept, but only I think because we're in 2018. I mean, if there's 100 different ways to answer that phrase, abortion is, and then fill in the blank. And at least one way to answer it would be abortion is it's a two-party conversation with only one party weighing in. Yeah,
Right.
Of course, you couldn't put that on a billboard, but we're not necessarily being language efficient when we talk about it. And if we just go back to some grammar, some basic subject, verb, object, and if we're able to talk about it honestly, recognizing that people will feel differently about it, then we at least have a start point, because you asked a great question. Where do we go, or what room is left? And what I think is fascinating is when we focus on, or when people tend to focus on nuanced arguments that are outside of the center argument, the core argument, the sort of irreducible fact. What is abortion actually? And in actuality, it's the termination of a pregnancy. It's the taking of a life for purposes that some may complain about, others may justify, or maybe they have some particular reasons, but we're not able to talk about it in language that is honest and visceral. We'll call it visceral, right? Because if we're in a space where we actually want to justify very difficult things, war, death, capital punishment, abortion, whatever, we should be honest about it. Otherwise, we tend to be separated a little bit from the act, and it becomes a desensitizing thing. But then you take a different slant, maybe I'll call it a business approach. And what you're really getting is advertising, right? Advertising like get with your favorite soda, Coke is life, or, Pepsi has, whatever the best flavor, whatever it is. These are messages being, I don't want to use the word propaganda as a negative, but more like publicized to encourage people to think about a product or service differently. Well, what's the service? And should we think about it differently? And the whole thing, to me, again, goes right back to, well, let's at least start with some honest language. And I think that's the first barrier to entry in this discussion for most people, is that we're unwilling to drop euphemisms in order to begin to talk about cleanly what we're doing. And by the way, we went through this in the military too. I'm a veteran, and it took us till 2004, I think it was, or maybe 5, to begin to use the word kill in our language in the military, because we have this tendency to euphemize things, where we talk about killing as neutralizing a target, or quelling the enemy or something, when in fact what we really mean is capture the enemy. So I'm a big fan of reducing it to its core language first, and then see if there's a place to begin that conversation. Otherwise, we're just companies advertising different publicized messages against each other.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's the commercialization of death is what it really is. But again, you're right. We use this flowery language, either pro-life and what is life, and then pro-choice and what is choice really, and we're not getting down to the nitty-gritty. One organization that I'm really fond of is called Save the Storks, and what they do is they provide ultrasounds, and what they've found is that about 8 out of 10 women who go into their trailers for ultrasounds change their minds. And why is that? Well, it's simply because it's not this thing out in the ether anymore, right? It becomes very real, and it's very similar to the brass tacks of being on a battlefield and meeting your enemy face to face, eye to eye, right? Versus this this abstract concept of taking another human life. And I don't want to get too in the weeds, because obviously I feel that death on the battlefield is justified, but it's a very real thing when it ceases becoming abstract and it becomes real. And
Right.
I agree with you. I think that to go forward in that, we definitely need to have a real conversation like adults and not treat it like a kid's topic, like we're in the living room talking because our kids are in the room. And we don't want to talk about it with a 3 or 4 year old in the room. But if you look at our policy and our dialogue, that's kind of how we talk about some of these issues. And it can be frustrating at times, but more importantly, I don't think it's helpful to the overall dialogue.
No, and you gave, by the way, I love that analogy because we know this as soldiers and combatants that, dropping a bomb from an airplane, I don't want to pretend that that's, an easy thing, but it does separate you from what you said, eye to eye contact with someone that you end up having to take the life of, which is a whole entire different realm of ramifications. And soldiers know that we come back with things that you don't get to put away once you've done that. Well, the difference is separation or connection to the activity. And I think that's what we're both saying in a way is the more connected you are to what it is you're discussing, the harder it is to gloss over it or make a generic argument or a general argument. And that's what I think we owe ourselves, as you said, as sort of responsible adult dialoguers, So, let's not be afraid of it. Let's get into it and embrace it.
Absolutely. All right, so my news bit today. So yesterday was a big day for degenerates and gamblers everywhere. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the law essentially outlawing sports gambling in America, with, of course, several exceptions, one being Nevada, of course. That was carved out, interestingly enough. But anyways, they ruled that was unconstitutional by a 7-2 and a 6-3 majority. There was kind of a concurrence with both the minority and the majority opinion by one of the justices. But nonetheless, there was a lot of people who were celebrating today or yesterday and going into today that they would soon be able to bet on their favorite team, ATS against the spread and all that jazz. So I want to kind of talk about a couple things on this, obviously touch on. So the first thing is that it's important to note that this was definitely a win for federalism and the 10th Amendment. So I want to highlight that as a positive. So essentially what Congress did, Congress really didn't outlaw sports gambling. What they did was prevent state legislatures from approving it. Okay, so that obviously is a gross usurpation of their constitutional authority. And Alito, in the majority opinion, basically alluded to such. He said, essentially, it would be like them putting the sergeant of arms of Congress in each state legislature, ensuring that they did the bidding of Congress. And that's not how it works, right? And so what he said is, hey, Congress, if you actually want to regulate this on a national level, then regulate it. But don't try to do a half measure, which is what they did. So I'm really glad that it was overturned on those grounds, because I think it's going to open up more challenges where Congress does this. And slowly over the past few years, the Supreme Court has kind of eroded what we would call kind of the carrot and the stick approach to state legislatures, right? Where they would withhold funding if the state legislatures didn't do their bidding. And that has been ruled unconstitutional in a couple instances. So I think we're going to get to a point where, we can actually have this legislative authority work the way it's supposed to work with states' rights. The other part of that, obviously, is the sports gambling aspect. Over 15 million Americans currently gamble on sports illegally. And so there is an argument that bringing it into the light will help with regulation, etc. So I kind of wanted to kick it to you guys. So not necessarily talking about gambling, yay or nay, but is there a benefit to regulating an activity instead of just carte blanche getting rid of the activity and prohibiting the activity. Is there really a benefit in capturing those revenues and ensuring that the consumers are protected, quote unquote?
First, I think you laid out a really good explanation for the case, because it's a little more complex than I think it looks on the surface. So I think we'll start by recognizing that part of what you said is encouraging that, in 1992, I think it was, they passed some really odd permutation of federal or presidential executive authority that really overrode the states' legislatures to the extent that they're kind of interfering with what the states' rights should be, right? So
Right.
number one, removing that obstacle, I think that's almost always a good thing. I'm sure I'll be challenged on that, or there'll be some exceptions. But if the states then can go back in and pass laws accordingly, we're getting back to more of a constitutional republic, which is allows us to have the state's laboratory. Well, on a second thought, with the regulation question, which I thought was an excellent question, is there a benefit to regulating activity versus sort of allowing it to flourish unregulated? And here I'm going to have to side with the old conservative in me that says, look, if we don't need regulation, we ought not have it just to have it. If there's value or criticality in life or limb or health of, we'll call it the infrastructure of the republic, then okay, maybe so you get air traffic control, you get road highways, safety issues and things like that. Then I think the regulation becomes very valuable, but it has to be constrained. It has to be checked. And one thing we know from watching our system over the years is we rarely see less regulation down the line. In other words, if we find smarter ways to do something, we have a much harder time peeling a regulation back once it's passed. So I'm very much, I would like to see cautious application, and I'd rather see it in U.S. code or statute law than regulation. I think that's where it appropriately belongs, because the final point that I think you drew out that I would emphasize is that it finally puts our representatives in the seat they belong, which is a seat of responsibility.
Yeah.
Take a stand. If you like it, vote for it. If you don't, vote against it, and then pass it as a law. That way, similar to what happened with the JCPOA, the Iran deal, you don't have to complain about somebody coming in and overturning what you've done, because you've actually put it on the books as a legal representation of our code. And Congress has been getting away with what I'll call half stroking their job for a long damn time. And I'm very, very encouraged to know that if these guys have to put their names on the signature line, then we're better off for it, because then we can hold them responsible and kick them out of office or vote for them to be back in office if we like what they did. So get them responsible. I'm all for it.
Well, and another thing too is like, hey, stop kicking your responsibility to the executive branch or to
the
another
court.
branch. Like, you're the legislative branch. You're the first branch.
Yeah.
How about you act like it?
That's right.
So,
Exactly.
And Jeremiah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think what's been interesting to me is the cognitive dissonance for some of our left leaning friends. My favorite. I really appreciated what you tweeted yesterday, Nathan. Refreshing to see all these liberal sports writers all of a sudden supportive of states' rights. And it's this idea that we support states' rights when it applies, but when it applies to a position that we care about. But if not, then absolutely, just give it to the president to just make a sweeping executive order, or leave it to the courts, to have 4 or 5 justices, determine what is constitutional or what is not for the entire country, and abandoning laws that are already on the books altogether. So it's very, very interesting to see that perspective.
It's amazing that states' rights isn't a euphemism for racism when they agree with it.
Well, hey, that's a lot of policy and some wonk, which I think is, you guys have spelled out very well. But when it comes down to brass tacks, as you said, Nathan, where do you guys sit? Would you gamble? Do you bet on sports? Is it going to change the game And do we lose something or do we gain something with guys now going to their local bars or establishments and throwing down some money to take the odds on their favorite football team? What are you guys thinking? Are you gamblers? Will you bet on this, or is that something forbidden, so to speak?
Yeah. So I am. I may or may not occasionally throw a dime or two on the occasional spread, but it it is definitely an interesting question. Like how far do you go to protect somebody from themselves, right? And this is obviously gambling can be an addiction, and you have the 1-800 numbers that say it. And so how far is it? How far do you go to protect somebody from themselves? And is it important? Sometimes you're going to sacrifice something that you want to do because it benefits the overall community. Okay, and so I will put it this way: if I had to completely give up, going to the occasional craps table and throwing $5 on a Nebraska line in the fall, would it wreck my world if I wasn't able to do so? If it made sure that somebody else wasn't going to completely wreck their financial lives and their family? That's an interesting question. I don't necessarily know where I fall on it, but I do know that person's probably wrecking their family anyways because they're going to some bank in the Caymans with an offshore site right now, or they have a local bookie. I can probably go up to a bar in Cleveland or a bar in Chicago, find a bookie and place a bet, right? Like, we know this stuff exists, and for people to say, "Oh, it's outlawed," okay, like,
Right.
that doesn't mean anything. What's also illegal? Like shooting people. Shooting people's illegal. Like, people still shoot people. Like, there's a lot of things that are illegal. Just because we make them illegal doesn't mean that we're actually going to prohibit the activity wholesale. But there is the other side that says, maybe we do need to have some of those additional protections. Now, I will say this. I am definitely more for casino gambling or sports betting than I am the lottery. I think that the lottery is a tax on people who are really, really bad at math. And it disproportionately affects lower income folks. Like, way disproportionately, as opposed to like casino. Like, casinos don't make their bank on lower income folks. They make their bank on whales, right?
Right.
Like, their business model is based off of getting whales in the door to spend lots of money. Like, they don't care about your $10 in the slot machine, grandma, right?
Sure.
So but the lottery though is the opposite. The lottery's entire business model is going after lower income and poor people, because guess what? Rich people don't play the lottery.
Sure, but let me devil's advocate this because it seems like that means you're placing the sort of the fulcrum of the argument is on your, and it wouldn't be just yours, but let me personalize it for a moment, on your personal opinion of the business model. And one of them is a little bit more, we'll call it pernicious, as you've outlined, versus the other, which you see as a little bit more, at least equitable or fair. So in this case, you might be making an argument more based on a subjective personal feeling than one that's, we'll call it statutory capable. In other words, could we make that, is that law, is that something that you could put into statute code, or is that more of a morality law issue?
Well, I think it's more of just a policy standpoint, right? I'm very hesitant to pass any kind of policies that are going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Any policy that is going to negatively affect one particular demographic over another. And for the government essentially through their agency via the lottery to make a buck off of it.
Sure. I see it. Jeremiah, where are you on this? Because this is good territory. Are you a bettor? Do you gamble? Do you like the law? Do you agree with Nathan on the state's lottery, or where do you sit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a fan of the state lottery. For multiple reasons, but there's so much messaging that goes into this is for the kids, this is for the schools, and it's like, well, so we're taxing the poor to support our schools and our education system. Like that doesn't make a lot of sense from a policy standpoint. But I mean, ultimately, to the bigger conversation, I think the closer we can get to the local level on these issues, the better. And that's where, if there's a city or there's a county or even a state that says, as a whole, we want to decide that this is not something that we're going to allow in our state, there needs to be a place for that. But that's where me as the voter, me as the constituent, I can have a real effect in that conversation, as opposed to some federal law that ultimately is going to lean more towards cronyism and allowing for certain areas or certain states based on lobbyists and other factors to benefit and basically pick winners and losers. So ultimately, my opinion comes back to that: the better local control, the better.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off that, like I opposed the casinos in Ohio, not necessarily because I opposed casinos, but because we were doing a constitutional amendment to allow them. And I was like, why am I live in Shelby, Ohio, why am I determining for Cleveland, Columbus, or Cincinnati whether they can have a casino in their local area? If the citizens of Cincinnati want a casino, I am all for the citizens of Cincinnati voting to have themselves a casino, because they're the ones that have to pay for the ramifications and some of the, we'll call them the external factors that go along with having a casino in your town, right? So if Cincinnati wants to vote on that, then you know what? I believe in that local control. I believe in that home rule, essentially, even if I disagree with it. Like, I don't want a strip club in Shelby, Ohio. I don't want a casino in Shelby, Ohio. I don't want an abortion clinic in Shelby, Ohio. But if another city decides to opt into one of those things, I don't believe it's my place to kind of overstep that. I think I look at it as a microcosm. And the same thing on a state level. If Nevada wants to have sports gambling, let them have sports gambling. But you know what? I'm all for having Ohio have the opportunity to make that decision for ourselves, and not people in Washington, D.C. who think they know better than us.
Truly states' rights and local rights issues. And I think that's a great place to live in. And I think you get a chance to be consistent and agree with those who disagree with you and say, hey, this is about the laboratory or the experiment of the states, and where you live is kind of how you get to vote eventually. So I can appreciate that a lot.
Absolutely. All right, so that is News Bits. So we're going to kind of jump into, usually we have kind of a serious segment. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Jason on to talk is because obviously he is a veteran, and as Jeremiah and I are. And we've gotten some feedback. We had some questions regarding military service. And kind of what that entails, and can you reconcile that with your faith? And so when it comes to military service and reconciling that with your faith, how do we do that? And so, Jason, I just wanted to kind of kick it off to you. You've faced, we all have in the military, we've faced moral quandaries, and we kind of talked about it before. We know that it's a lot easier to kill another human being via a drone strike than to actually patrol a town and meet the people in that town and how it's going to negatively affect them, right?
Right.
I kind of liken it to on the last episode we talked about policing and community policing. If you're a police officer and you don't know the people in the neighborhood that you're patrolling, it's a lot easier to make negative assumptions versus if you live among them or you understand the dynamic, you have a relationship there. And it's the same thing if you're patrolling in the streets of Baghdad or wherever. So what's your take, Jason, on how do we reconcile our faith with military service? How do we go about doing that? But also, what are some of those moral things that you've had in your background that have kind of shaped your belief system when it comes to that?
Yeah, excellent question. By the way, I love that you intro this segment by saying now we're going to talk about something serious after we've talked abortion and the state of Israel as well as gambling. So it's a great segue. But so we'll get deeper now. So I love it. This reconciliation of faith. I like the question in that first it forces you to face the issue of what is it that may need reconciling. And I think some people may approach this. Everyone's going to have a little bit different of an approach, but a lot of this goes back to your grounding, your foundational principles, and as a Christian, I adhere to fundamental Judeo-Christian values. And of course, that leaves a wide spectrum for people to kind of nitpick or refine or nuance subtleties here and there. But overall, we have several obligations that are sort of primary as it relates to this question. The defense of innocence is one of them. How do we protect those who either can't protect themselves or have a tremendous need for some sort of extraordinary protection? Well, this is the answer that puts you right in the space of military, law enforcement, and maybe a few other locations, right? We need police, and we need them to be able to have the authority to adjudicate in dynamic situations, make decisions that are life and death. Well, we extend that to the military as a sort of a communal extension to the nation. So the reconciliation for me, number one, is recognizing that first and foremost, I believe in the just causes of war as we've laid them out. Not always. Clearly, we'll make mistakes here and there, but on the whole, we generally see our military used from the United States as a liberation force, as a force for good in the world. And there may be extreme examples where that goes wrong or goes south. But what's interesting about the United States is we prosecute those examples. Everyone is probably familiar, and maybe some are not, but the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. What we said was, in general, the military acted accordingly and honorably. But here in this particular case, military service members were well beyond their honorable rights or their authority, and we prosecuted them accordingly. So one, you have to have faith in the system that you're serving, the people and the leaders that you've put in place. So that's number one. Number two, you really, if you're conflicted as an individual, it may not be the right space for you. I think it's interesting that we see that dialogue in the New Testament when we talk about food and the sort of dietary restrictions that were placed on members of the Judaic faith. And the conversation lightly had was essentially that at some point an individual who's challenged should step back and very cautiously approach what their decision is. But if you feel confident, if you feel that you're in the space that God's wanted you to be, or that your country is in the right space, then you should have the confidence of going forward and taking up the authority that sometimes comes with the choice of life and death with it. Because if we don't do it, then we leave that space open for those people who are maybe not driven by a moral code, people that don't have a deep faith and become participants in adjudicating that authority on the spot, will most definitely overrun, they don't have a moral guideline, but they may overrun what we see as a moral premise from the United States standpoint. So personally, it was never a terribly daunting question for me, but it's one that I think I take very seriously. And what that means to me personally, Nathan, Jeremiah, on the battlefield is this: when you get into a conflicting situation, children on the battlefield, and by children I mean males under the age of 17, really, right? Or military age males okay, not too much of a question. There's a gunfight, and you've made your choices. They've made their choices. Once you get a little bit down into the weeds with 14-year-old kids slinging grenades or shooting, outside their bedrooms at a convoy going by, it starts to get really difficult really quickly. And by the way, I think it should be. I don't think this should ever be an easy question, but you're going to be faced
Amen.
with these consequences that you'll live with, and no matter what you choose, it's conflicting. So then the real question is, how do you stomach that? How do you protect yourself from one uh, bypassing your moral code, but while also protecting those around you and servicing your cause? Well, that's a question that we're all taught as soldiers. You have the responsibility in that space, in that time, to make a decision. If you're doing something you know is amoral or immoral or unethical, you have a responsibility to stop, report, cease action, and turn in those people who haven't obeyed the law, so to speak. I've never been in that position. So thank God, I've never had to, look around at my peers and say, hey, this has gone too far. So for me, that's number one. Number two, you asked about the shaping and what sets you up for these conditions. This to me is where the real critical foundation is laid. In my life, I had great parents. They instructed me well. I was very much, grew up in a family of discipline, and we sought, we'll call it mentorship and instruction from our faith system, the fundamental Judeo-Christian values, and those values were laid in, as a child, and they stick with you as an adult, assuming you didn't rebel or discard them or find another system. So to me, that's the beauty of it. If you have great parents, if you've studied, if you understand who you are in your faith, in your personality, those questions are a lot, I'll say they're less conflicting, though they may continue to be very challenging, if that makes sense. I mean, it might be a bit of an irony. In other words, you're still stuck with the ultimate feeling of maybe disgust or disappointment if you're faced with an underage male shooting at you and you have to take a decision. But at least you've been raised in a particular way, you adhere to those codes, and you're gonna live up to that to the extent that it is possible, and not regret a decision that you may have to make at some point. And if you do regret those decisions, you have to go back and deconstruct and say, where did I go wrong, or where did I miss that? And so it's a little bit different for everyone. But for me, I would thank my family, my community, the church, the school, my teachers, my Boy Scout leaders, but as importantly, my military trainers, my military instructors, my sergeants, my senior NCOs, my captains, and whatever colonels, all enforce the same code of ethics that I grew up learning. So maybe that's not a whole answer, but maybe it points us in the right direction.
Yeah, so I think that's awesome, and I couldn't agree more with all that. I remember at a homeschool convention, you kind of told a story about one particular moment. We'll call it an inflection point, because it wasn't really a moment of crisis, right? But it was an inflection point, I think, when you were kind of doing an operation, and there's somebody on the opposite side of the door, and you have a choice to make. Can you kind of walk through that kind of that story? Because I think that story kind of really encapsulates what we're discussing here in an abstract way, but I think it encapsulates it in a very real way.
Yeah, and I'll start by saying, I don't. It's hard to say after the fact. You never want to go back and Monday morning quarterback it, but you never really know until you do if you've made the right decision. But here's the situation: we were set up on a house, investigating someone who was proliferating weapons and destruction in the city. So we knew we were chasing a guy that was a nefarious character. Our mission was to kill or capture him. We had already set up on the house some devices, had some intelligence that took us there in the middle of the night, crawled over the wall, isolated with my partner. He was underneath the car. And the mission at this point was the first stage of the mission, to set some devices to make sure we could follow and track the individual. Well, I was holding security on the door, So if everything went well, we would put the device in, slip back over the wall, head back to the base, and follow this target. But that didn't go down this way. While I'm under nods, the NVGs, the night vision goggles, watching the interior in case somebody came out, a helicopter flew over, a couple dogs barked, and right away, someone on the inside of the building, who we believe to be a suspect terrorist, has woken up and is approaching the door with essentially a light in his hands, the keys that were lit up, and you could see his AK-47 clearly because it's one of those kind of glass smoke doors with a little bit of a curtain behind it or something, a sheer kind of curtain. So at this point, I'm compressing time a little, but as he's starting to move to the door, I'm not able to communicate to my partner, who's now slipped under the car, that a situation is developing. Now I can't leave him there unsecured, so I have a decision to make pretty quickly. If this guy comes out, or if he never opens the door and starts shooting, I'm going to go down pretty quickly. So I have to make a decision on whether to launch bullets through that door and put this target down, assuming he's aggressive and it's the right guy, or try to go through the door, possibly get into a gunfight and scramble for an advantageous position. And honestly, at this moment, Nathan, I as I told the story before, I'll never forget this. This is the moment that I'm not sure which decision I'm going to make, and I don't know if it's going to turn out right if I go through this door. So it's the point where they say, "Oh, your life flashes before you." Well, in some ways, it really does. Instantly, I was familiar with my wife and my daughters at home, and this is around Christmas time or somewhere on this deployment. So I don't know if I'm ever going to see him again, and it starts to get that wallowing sadness, that pit of despair inside. But just as quickly, you're able, I think, through training and great instruction, to kind of put that in a box. I knew that Keisha, my wife, and I had really established a strong family. So if I had to leave her, if the Lord called me home, I knew that she was capable of carrying on the task of raising our daughters. So that made me feel a little bit more at ease and sad because this may be the end. But I put that in a box, put it to the side, and at that moment, what kicks in is now it's time to go to work. I've already made the decision. I'm going to go through this door. I don't know what's going to happen on the other side of it, but this was the right decision, at least for me at the time. And everything for me then just went into warp speed mode. Crashed through the door. I'm a pretty big guy, so I was able to kind of put hands on this guy before he knew what was happening. We wrestled to the ground, secured the weapon, and went through the entire target after that. The rest of the forces came in and secured everything. And the real point of the story for me was this. What we learned after that was that this was not the guy that we had been targeting, and that some of our intel sources kind of took us off course and put us on someone that was, at least for what we were chasing, innocent. Whether he was innocent at large, I don't know, but he wasn't guilty of anything we knew of. And so the decision not to shoot him, launch bullets through that door, for me was, as you called it, an inflection point, and one that I only really understood after going through that incident. I'll never regret that moment and that decision. Yeah. However, I might have lost on that. Talk about gambling, right? That's a 50-50. If he fires off rounds first, I may not have gone home. And so if someone made a different decision in that choice, he could have been just as right. So the point there is some moral ambiguity. There are some ambiguities on the battlefield. All I know is when I did make that decision, the reward is being able to walk away and not have to replay that moment in my head and know that I took the wrong person's life.
Well, absolutely, right? And I think that's so powerful in a couple ways. So, on the previous episode, we were talking about policing. And we were talking about how sometimes what happens in these confrontations with police and what happens. And there are a lot of inflection points that happen, especially in minority communities. And I would say that some of those inflection points the police choose wrongly. And to have that kind of restraint on the battlefield is only possible, like you said, it's only possible when you are secure in, your family's secure, but you're also secure in your faith. And you're like, you know what? If God calls me home, then that's what it is. Like, I don't think you can make that decision if you're teetering on what happens on the other side, right? And I think that's, there's a saying that there are no atheists in foxholes, and I think that saying is pretty prescient for a couple reasons, but I think it's also prescient for the fact that you cannot be the best soldier that you can be in those trenches if you're not secure in what's happening on the other side. And, Jeremiah, you were a chaplain's assistant, and you kind of were involved in the ministry aspect of reaching out to the people in the trenches, so to speak. What is that like, ministering on that level for maybe some young men who haven't quite figured that piece out?
Yeah, so this is a really, I think, a really important discussion. Obviously we're three veterans here, but I think too often there's a lot of people that haven't had the military experience that talk about things, and they don't really have a proper perspective. And I even see that within the military, looking at people having opinions on faith in the military, and maybe they don't come from a faith background. I specifically remember one instance when I was at basic training, and we had a chaplain, a visiting chaplain, come through, and he was as hardcore as you get. I mean, he had the Ranger tabs and the combat infantry badges and the airborne and every possible badge that we looked as fresh recruits, and we looked at and we said, wow, this guy's a bad mamma jamma. But I remember having a conversation with one of the guys in my platoon who said, this guy's a chaplain. Like, look at what all he's done and what all he's been through. Like, he's obviously killed some guys. And how do you be a chaplain after the fact? And this guy, happened to, be a self-professing Catholic, and myself as a Protestant Christian, I said, what's the difference between you and I and him? If we come from a faith background and we chose to be in the military, and we chose to, at some point, we could be in that position as well, what's the difference between, us and that chaplain? He just took a different route. And so, when I was overseas last year as a chaplain assistant, I found myself having those same types of conversations with both soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the post that I was stationed, and people really dealing with that. I come from a faith background, but I really haven't fully come to grips with my faith, and I think that, like I said, I think that they're important conversations to have. For me, it comes down to the fact that, as a country, we're not just a country as a whole. Our country is made up of people. And I'd say the same thing for our military. Obviously, our military is made up of real people coming from differing backgrounds. And ultimately, if someone has an issue with the idea of serving in the military and coming from a faith background, being a committed Christian, my question is, who do you want representing us in times of war? Who do you want representing us at home and abroad? Who do you want representing our military and ultimately our country to the far ends of the earth? Do you want it to be people like Jason Beardsley said, who don't have that faith background or who don't have a solid moral compass? Or do you want that to be people that, share our Judeo-Christian values? Do you want that to be people that will ultimately not just represent the United States of America, but represent our Christian faith and represent our Lord and Savior?
Well, and for me, I think it's also to the fact that, Jason, you had mentioned that some of these decisions should be difficult, and I agree.
Absolutely.
But I think that all three of us know people and have met people for whom those decisions didn't seem too difficult or as difficult as they should have been.
Yes.
Right.
And
Yes.
um, that's the crux for me, and this is why I think it's very important for men and women of faith to get their hands dirty in every bit of our culture, whether it's the military, the police, firefighters, teachers, music artists, business owners. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, we are not just called to be quote unquote members of the church in a capacity of ministry, but we're called to be members of our culture in capacities of ministry, because we're called to be an example wherever we're at. We're called to be that light, and we're called to offer the world one simple question: would our lives be better or worse if there were no Christians in our life? And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who believe that their lives would be better if there were no Christians in their life. And I think that's a reflection not on them, that's a reflection on us, because a lot of times we take our roles very seriously within the four walls of the church, but we do not take our roles as seriously outside those walls. And that is a shame, right? Like, if we're looking at the apocalyptic rapture, right? I want the world to miss us when we're gone. I don't want the world to say good riddance.
Yeah,
And
I'll capitalize on that too, because you bring up some great points in Jeremiah as well, that when there are folks around us that have met with difficulty or trauma, be it on the battlefield or otherwise, if we can't provide some hope or some sense of love or rapport or comfort, guys, this is why we're losing our soldiers at 22 a day. We have men and women coming back that have been traumatized and have felt isolated and don't know who to reach out to. And let's hope that we're not that person that showed up in their life as a passerby, never paid attention. And even if it wasn't necessarily sharing everything you have, but just giving them that one glimpse of hope or that one sort of arm around the shoulder to say, hey, buddy, I got you, man. And if we don't know the walks that they've taken, if we don't know the darkness or the deep places they've seen, they're not going to be compelled to listen. And so you mentioned some people may not have a difficulty with a decision. And the truth is, there are plenty who become accustomed to it. And if that time for them comes that they need to reach out, and we're not there because we've avoided that sphere of influence, well, where are they going to go? They're going to look to the bottle, drugs, suicide, something other than a healthy way to transition.
Gambling.
Well, gambling. Amen. Right. Gambling in Israel after having an abortion, right? Can we say that?
I think you just did.
I think you just did.
Oh, man. Oh, edit that out.
All right. Another thing, too, I wanted to touch on, too. So while we're talking about kind of moral questions, let's talk a little bit about something that kind of kicks us all in the proverbial pants here, Jason. Ego. It is very, very difficult to be in a, we'll say, testosterone-laden world. Obviously there are women that serve in the military. We all know that. But, in a lot of the jobs that we served in on the front lines, there weren't as many. I served in a squadron where we did not have females when I was deployed, and so it's very testosterone laden. But we have to keep that ego in check. Now, there's a lot of people out there who are listening who might have some problems with that ego and stuff like that. So, what are some practical steps or examples that you can point to that will help people in that regard?
That's a huge question. I really appreciate it. I think killing the ego is quite possibly one of the hardest things we run into as individuals, no matter where we sit on the life spectrum. And I'd love to meet the person that's had a fantastic time or an easy time with it. But it's taken me a while. And I understood through a lot of help and mentorship from seniors that I trusted, trainers that I trusted, on working through this process whereby we set aside our own internal ego to look across at others and see them for who they are, not who we think they are. It's allowing that sort of personal feeling of I need this, or I'm good, or I'm better, or I know what I'm talking about. It's allowing that to subside and quietly suppress the internal thoughts, the dialogue that happens in your head, and actually listen to the people across from you. That's a really hard thing to do, but the real advantage, the benefit to that is when you do, it turns on a whole new world for us as individuals. You begin to rather than judge others, rather than pre-assign them an answer, rather than carry their dialogue for them, you actually begin to hear them for who they are. And this is the best way to take people, to really let them be themselves. And rather than judge them, rather than, cut them off at the knee, so to speak, in your head, begin to understand them and even look to try to understand why they are that way. You're not always going to get the answer, but what I found is you'll learn a lot more about the other people if you care about them. Now, this, by the way, helped me in my marriage, being able to listen to my wife, and she doesn't speak the same language as I do because she's a woman. And so we had to learn over the years that I was saying a lot of things perfectly clear that she just didn't understand. Well, it turns out when I flipped the script, it turns out that I wasn't really understanding her as well. So killing the ego helped make us healthier in that space. As a business person, it allowed me to understand the equities of the people I get to work with and have to sign deals with. As a military member, an intelligence officer, collecting intelligence on the battlefield is all about killing the ego. It's about shutting up that voice inside and just quietly listening to the other person, getting inside the space where you say to yourself, for right now, for this moment, the person I'm with is the most important person in my life. And being able to do that teaches us a lot more about our fellow brothers and sisters than any sort of dialogue I'll run in my head. It's been a phenomenal transition for me, but I got to tell you, it was not easy. And it took years of kind of beating that out of me, because they teach you in the military to a certain extent to reduce your ego. But the more you escalate into special operations, intelligence, the more that has to be a refined tool, because pretty quickly you start dealing with people that are nothing like you. And as soon as you begin to presume for them, you start to lose little battles, little tactical fights, little dialogue battles, right? You can't win that way. So when you are able to reduce this ego, and it's the hardest thing, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The one thing you're going to lose is a little bit of pride in your estimation of who you are. And as soon as you lose that pride and that estimation, you're on your way to unlocking the door to crushing life. So,
yeah, I mean, one of the things that Nathan and I have talked about, and I think I've discussed this with you, Jason, as well, is this idea of in the military specifically, are veterans better off because they were in the military, or does their background enable them in a military setting to really shine and their
Yep.
character getting exposed? And this is something we've talked about in a couple prior episodes. Things like money and power and even social media simply being a vehicle that ultimately exposes our character. And so something that you talked about earlier with your background and growing up in a good home and being taught Judeo-Christian values and really getting that solid foundation. Then when you're entered into a military situation, when you're entered into that lifestyle, there's going to be those challenges that come up, and there's going to be those situations where we are humbled, and on the flip side, where we could very easily get a big head, grow our ego to the expense of everyone else, to our subordinates, to our leadership, and for me, that ultimately comes down to your background and your character. What you bring into the military, your background, is ultimately going to, and I'd say this in any walk of life, what you bring into a given circumstance is going to affect how you react to that circumstance. And I think that applies when you're talking about ego, when you're talking about humility, when you're talking about some of these issues. Having that solid foundation is instrumental.
Yeah, but look, we also want to be careful, because one of the things that I would also recommend is that, this doesn't have to be the long, traditional background of coming from the great family and, having this all laid out, because ultimately the individuals who came from a challenged place or saw some trauma in their lives, they get the same opportunities, but it requires the exact same kind of, we'll call it methodology, which is to be able to sublimate or suppress that ego and be able to take instruction and listen to those around you. So we're all familiar with the guys that came in with us into military, the girls,
Right.
and they came from the roughest of backgrounds, the Fred Douglasses or the Harriet Tubmans, or people that were challenged and grew up in really hard circumstances. But the choice is always ours, as adults especially, to be able to make that defined choice. And if you know what the plan is, if you know how to better yourself, you don't have to have had 20 years or 18 years or 15 years of training to get there. What you really have to do is make conscious decisions on an everyday, every moment basis to choose to be the right type of person. That's a choice. It's hard to do sometimes. We don't always get it right, but it is available to those who come from the widest variety of backgrounds. So that's a beauty. And I'll tell you that the key for me with ego, because you asked about methodology, to how do you build that in? How do you build the ego reduction in? And I've said this before. We've talked about it. I call it the small fail cycles. You've got to be humbled, and the only way you're going to get humbled, humiliated sometimes, is if you fail. And if you're not failing in life at something, if you're not doing things that bring up some failures, you may want to challenge yourself and see if you're really stretching far enough. You don't have to fail at everything. You shouldn't, but you should have controlled fail experiments. And what that means is, if you're comfortable, you're doing great at your job or your school or whatever it is you're doing, you might want to add something to your plate that causes you to stretch to the point that you're not going to be good. And the way I look at it with kids, you take a kid that's really brilliant at playing the piano, but may not be so good at baseball. Well, that's a great place to learn how to kill the ego. Get on a field and do something you're not good at, and look around, shut up and listen, and learn from those around you. You're going to start to build the muscle memory in of how to be a good follower, how to be a good student, how to uplift others when you're not the confident superstar or star quarterback, U.S. Navy SEAL, Green Beret, or whatever that you are. So I would just recommend, for folks that don't know how to do this, find spaces in your life that are somewhat controllable, where you're actually going to be challenged well beyond your comfort zone. You'll get those muscle memories. It takes a while. It's not easy, but it will change your life.
Absolutely. And you talked a little bit about fearing failure, and I just wonder how much we miss out on because we fear that failure. Or more important, we choose fear over failure.
Yes. Yeah.
And we always choose failure over fear. And what I mean by that is, like, it's okay to fail.
Yes.
It's okay to fail. There's no negative in failure inherently, but I think that a lot of times we're just bound by that fear that we're going to fail, that we don't actually push through. And there's so many examples in history of those who refuse to be bound by that failure and ended up doing really, 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 really great things because they pushed through.
That's right.
And I'll be amazed at how many of us are, we're gonna get to a place where we don't. I'll put it another. I'm amazed. I'm gonna be amazed at how many of us were so close to achieving that which we thought was impossible, but we quit before we got through.
The majority, I would say, right? That's the story.
Right, yeah.
And again, to get through it, we remember our military calls it an obstacle course, and they changed that somewhere along the way to a confidence course. And the whole point is, I don't like the term failure, because I prefer to see things as obstacles. When you learn how to come past an obstacle, it was not a failure. It was a learning point. It was a confidence point. You're training confidence in your heart and in your mind. So it's a challenge, But if the individual is willing to challenge themselves, become a little embarrassed, look a little bit like humiliation or pride reduction, you're going to find that the world will open up for you. It's a beautiful thing. It's ironic, and it's an inversion of what we think. So, how else do we expect it to work, right?
Yeah, and it's also the key to amazing leadership. And in July, I believe it is, we're going to walk through kind of a leadership series on this podcast. So I may have you back, Jason, to help us work through a couple of those principles that we're going to be talking about. So,
I'd love to do it. If you make the call, I'll be there.
Yeah, it has been so good to have you on. Thank you so much, brother, for being on with us and talking about a lot of these and sharing your heart and your passion. And I really think that those who are listening understand now why we love you so much, and we're glad that you're in our life, man. So we're going to talk a little bit about feedback. So Jeremiah, for those who are wanting to get a hold of the podcast, ask questions, ask us to talk about different topics, how do they get a hold of us?
So the easiest way to get a hold of us is on social media. We're at Money Power Pod on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's at Money Power Pod. And so we would love to get your feedback and get your topics of suggested topics for us to go over in future episodes. We'd love to hear your feedback from this episode and show Jason Beardsley some love here.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, anything, if you disagree with us, if you agree with us, if you hate Nathan's guts, I mean, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
All right, and so on that topic, please also, if you do like the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. It helps our rankings, I guess, or something. But anyways, we have a perfect 5.0 rating. So if you don't like the podcast, just let us know about that on the Facebook and the Twitter.
Yes.
But if you do like the podcast, please rate us. We got some pretty cool ratings. So someone, DW Sling said, thought-provoking as well as an entertaining show. Keep them coming. And then we got another one. Said, I've tried listening to other shows, but this one is far superior. A level approach to all topics, plus Rob's voice is amazing. That was from Chick of Jesus. I think that might be Rob's wife.
I thought it might be Jason Beardsley, but
well, maybe. And then someone said, a politician, a financier, and a pastor. ... No punchline, just a great show that looks and on money and politics and culture with hot takes and grounded wisdom, and it's a fun ride. And that was from My Hope Journey. So thank you for all the feedback that we're getting, and I think we're, if you stuck with us past the pilot, God bless you. And I think we're starting to actually get to a point where we're kind of hitting our stride here on some stuff. So thank you for everyone who's been with us. It's getting kind of late, and I've been up since very early in the morning. But you know what keeps me going, Jeremiah?
What's that, Nathan? Strike
Force Energy. It is a veteran-owned company. They have wonderful, it's an energy drink that comes in an aluminum packet, and it's a liquid that you're able to mix right into your drink. And the best thing about it is all the vitamins, all the energy you need, but no crash. And it is awesome.
Yeah. So even tonight, I've got a water carbonator at home, and so I made some carbonated water, and I squeezed a packet of Strike Force into the bottle, and so it made a nice little instant energy drink. And because it's a liquid, it can be mixed with anything, mixed with other sodas or alcohol or basically anything that you can come up with. If you search online, there's some pretty wacky concoctions that people have come up with. But basically, you can turn anything into an energy drink, yeah, tastes great as well.
Yeah, so this episode is brought to you by Strike Force Energy, and we encourage all of you to try it. And please use our coupon code MAP, that stands for money and power, for 20% off all orders at strikeforceenergy.com. Jason, you need to get on that.
I'm on it, man. I'm about to mix it with some bourbon.
Awesome.
And as an added bonus, if any of our listeners do end up trying it for the first time, we'd love to hear what you think. Let us know if it has changed your life like it's changed ours. I can't make any promises, but you will lose weight, you will increase your speed, and you will be 100 times more productive.
And you might be more attractive to your significant other.
I've heard that as well.
I have, ever since I've started drinking. My wife doesn't leave me alone. All right. So we've come to the part of the show that is our wives' favorite part of the show, and that is the end, where we go over our parting shots. Jeremiah.
Yeah, so this kind of comes from feedback on Facebook. Got a comment from Kevin Small on Facebook, but I wanted to utilize it, recognize it here as a part of as my parting shot. So Kevin says on our Facebook page, he says, "Another great episode, guys. I wanted to comment on y'all's presentation. You remind me a lot of The Daily Show back when Jon Stewart was the host. Even though you guys have strong views, you present them in a way that an objective listener who disagrees with your position can still enjoy the show and listen to your points. You guys are also good about giving it to evangelicals, the church, conservatives, etc. when they're wrong, even though they're the home team." I really appreciated this comment, Kevin. So thank you for all your support and all your encouragement. But, one of the things that I think we're trying to do here as a podcast is, we all come from a conservative slant in our political views. We all come from a Judeo-Christian background. Although the jury's still out on Nathan, whether he's saved or not. But we come from that background. But ultimately, our goal in everything that we do, we want to call balls and strikes. We want to, point out inconsistencies in viewpoints. We want to be a place where we can have rational discussion, and we want to bring people on even. We're looking into, guests that are going to come from a very different viewpoint. And so we can have a rational discussion and prove that even on issues that me, Nathan, and Rob disagree on, that we can have, rational discourse. And when we have guests on, that we can vehemently disagree with someone, and not be a complete jerk about it. We think it's one thing that's lost in our current culture, and that's the whole kind of the impetus for this show. And so it is encouraging that's being noticed by our listeners. Whether you agree with us, whether you disagree with us, we hope that this is a place where we can at least come and not be complete jerks and have rational discussion about a variety of topics. So really appreciate the feedback, and like we said, keep the feedback coming.
All right, Jason, your parting shot.
All right, my parting shot is essentially for everybody out there that's just a little too sensitive in the skin, right? We are in 2018, and God forbid you say anything that crosses, the wrong stream, so to speak, right? We can't talk about sex, religion, or politics. Well, after that, there's really not much to talk about except maybe sports gambling. And so if I were to make a call, it would say something like, toughen up. This is America. We've been through 2 world wars, which we won. We caused a revolution and tilted the world power balance towards our continent. We are striving to become even greater, and that cannot happen if we cannot use honest dialogue. If you're black and you're white, or you hate someone, or you can't talk about the differences in an honest way, then get off the playing field, because for far too long we've been ratcheting down to the point that we're no longer allowed to have these honest discussions. And so for me, whether it's in our politics, on our media, in our culture, my parting shot is don't buy into it if it causes you to go completely, we'll call it ambivalent towards your reality, right? Make a stand, be willing to defend it. And one last thing, if you're in a meeting, a sensitive meeting, and your boss says something, or somebody next to you says something that you were offended by, take it to that person first before you get out on your cell phone and make the call to the local press and try to spill it all over the news so you can aggrandize your own self-power. It's time to stop acting like little whiny kids on the playground and start acting like the men who built and the women who built America. That's my parting shot.
And what a parting shot that is.
Wow.
All right.
We need to bring Beardsley back just every week just for his parting shots.
I think that's what we need to do. Kind of like it was Andy Rooney at the end of 60 Minutes. We just need to have Jason just do a parting shot. Just him doing parting shots.
It could get a little bloody.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm all about it. It's just you record your parting shot. We'll just put it at the end and call it a day. Because there's nothing else. It definitely beats my my diatribe on pizza and delivery pizza fees. So
yeah, basically my response to, he complained about how they charge $1.99 to deliver his pizza. And, my response was basically your response to America, Beardsley. And that is, Nathan, toughen up. Like it's
suck it up, Buttercup.
It's $1.99. Come on.
Yeah, but it doesn't even go to the I'm not gonna relitigate this. All right, my parting shot is a recommendation. And that is Jason Beardsley's company, the Underground Movement. They do a lot of really cool stuff when it comes to apparel, and they're every bit of apparel that goes through their warehouse has a story, and more importantly, it's our story, the story of greatness, the story of America. And so that's my recommendation. Support this man and what he's doing, and who knows, we might have him as a sponsor.
Well, we would be glad to. And I'll just tell you, you guys can break news here because we haven't rolled this out yet. But the Underground Movement is going to be kind of morphing. We found some great partners. We're going to go through a little bit of a brand. We'll call it a relaunch, if you will. And so you can look for us to pop up here under a new name and with some new folks partnering with us to distribute the gear across America. And what we'll do is I'll come back on the show when we do the official launch, give you all the deets, and get you out there with some promotion codes.
All right, let's do it.
Beautiful.
Hey, and where can people, in the meantime, where can people find you?
Right now, go to thebootlife.com, where our partnership is actually now merged with some folks up in Mansfield. I think you guys know the stores up there.
Yeah.
And we are building phase 2 of this thing, and it is going to be awesome. Stand by.
All right. Well, we look forward to it. So breaking news, guys. That's awesome. All right.
First to hear it.
That is our parting shots. So thank you all for listening to our podcast. It's truly humbling, the response we've gotten. Thank you to Strikeforce Energy for supporting the endeavor and sponsoring us, and for Jeremiah Martin, for Jason Beardsley. I am Nathan Martin, and thank you for listening.
I got the money in the pile. Yeah. Once you get a little, they just wanna take you down, cuz we've been going hard for too long. Can't get enough, what is you on? Yeah. Really ain't nothing, I could drop that. Wake up in the morning, make it all day. It's nothing to get it poppin', wanna